The psalmist begins with two questions. Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle and who may dwell in your holy hill? Seems like some strange questions. Like, who couldn't abide and dwell with God in his holy hill? Strange for us to suggest that God would put any kind of limitations on that at all, especially when you consider what is taught and accepted in mainstream Christianity today. Wouldn't God want anyone and everyone to be there? The truth is, no, he doesn't. He has standards that we need to meet. You can't just be close to or dwell with or be with God just because you decide you're going to be there. And so there are some very relevant questions here. Who can dwell with God? Who can abide in his holy hill? Because not everybody can. Those are some questions that are asked a lot throughout the Psalms. There are just some people who can't be close to God because of their lies and iniquity, because they don't measure up to the standards or the requirements that God has established for being in his presence or being close to him. And think about how that worked with the temple. There were some limitations on touching sacred things that were in the presence of God, like in Numbers 4. They couldn't touch or look at holy objects or they would die. Like, that's how sacred and special these objects were because they were in the presence of God. They couldn't be touched. Remember Uzzah? And notice what happens the closer you get to God. Like, you have the planet, and then you have the small nation of Israel as God's own special possession. Then you have Jerusalem, which is even smaller, as God's special city. Then you have Mount Zion inside of Jerusalem as God's special mountain in Jerusalem. And you have the courtyard of the Gentiles, which is the closest the Gentiles could come. Then you have the courtyard of the women, the courtyard of the men, and you have the temple courtyard where only the priests and the Levites could enter. Then you have the temple sanctuary. Only a specific priest could enter in specific times of the day. Then you have the holiest of holies where only the high priest could enter in once a year. What's that telling us? See, the closer you get to God and his presence, the more holy and special it is. The greater the standards become, the more restrictive things become. And so when we understand the answers to the questions that the psalmist asks here, we can better understand God's character. We can better have the fear that we're supposed to have, which is the beginning of our wisdom. And so look at the 10 standards that the psalmist gives for being in the presence of God. And so who is it that's supposed to dwell with God? There are 3 positives there in verse 2. He says, he who walks uprightly. And so his lifestyle is blameless. He's upright. He has good character. He goes on to define what that looks like in the next 2. He works righteousness. He does the right thing. To work righteousness means that you have the right standards to live by. He uses God's word as his standards to what's right and wrong, and he has the self-discipline to do the right thing. And then he says that he who speaks the truth in his heart. And so we serve God, a God of truth. He's very concerned about truth. Remember who the father of lies is. That's Satan. He's a liar from the beginning. The truth is not in him. Like, we live in a society that is kind of devoid of truth. We devalue it. And so people go by what works and instead of what's truth. And so truth goes out the window. But notice that person who dwells with God speaks truth where? In his heart. Where your heart and your lips, they have to line up. And so we need to be honest. And the next one, he says, he who does not backbite with his tongue. He doesn't badmouth people. He doesn't try to run them down. He doesn't say things to others that are going to create suspicions or questions that are for other people. And then he goes on to say that he does no evil to his neighbor. It's not just a matter of what he says about them. It's a matter of what he does to them. And then he says he who does not take up a reproach against his friend. And so here's a person who does not accept slander against another. He's careful not to just accept anything and everything that somebody has to say about somebody. He realizes that's not fair. And so if I would dwell with God, I need to be careful in how I'm going to treat others. And then he says, he whose eyes a vile person is despised and honors those who fear the Lord. He looks at a person the way that God looks at a person. God despises the wicked. And so those who dwell with God despise the wicked. They don't make their heroes people whose character are not consistent with God. They don't glamorize wickedness. And so he goes on to mention a few other things that we won't take the time. And he finishes by saying, he who does these things shall never be moved. This psalm really needs to be one of the most regularly visited psalms in our Bibles. Like, we often look to different psalms to encourage us and strengthen us and for various reasons, but Psalm 15 is one that needs to resonate with every child of God. It's challenging. It's a reminder that not everyone can dwell with God. And so Psalm 15 is a psalm of holiness that promotes true worship. And so I hope you find the challenge there. I hope you can find the value in this.